Okay, so this is a recording for the students who are on my evening class in international ethics this term. And the class that we were going to have this evening has been cancelled due to the spread of the SARS coronavirus 2. And so I thought I'd record a video to give an introduction to the issue which we were going to focus on tonight. And this is relating to the reading which I gave out, which was chapter 11 of Joseph Carens' book, The Ethics of Immigration, which covers a lot of issues about questions of immigration. But the one we're going to be focusing on is whether states should continue to have a right to exclude outsiders from entry, sort of for permanent residence or eventually citizenship, which is the status quo, because this has been challenged actually initially by Carens himself, and this position which has been known as the argument for open borders, where people should be free to migrate to other states if they desire to do so. And it's not a position that's popularly held in wealthier states. Probably a politician who advocates opening up the borders wouldn't get very many votes. And that's probably on the assumption that there would be very large numbers of people who would take the opportunity, were it available to them, to move. But we don't know for sure how many people would move. There are only estimates about this, and the estimates actually range from 1% of the population of the poorer states moving to the wealthier ones, all the way up to 40%, which is obviously a huge number if you think about the much larger population of people in the poorer states of the world compared to the wealthier states. But the 40% figure, I should say, it comes from a survey of asking people whether they'd be interested in moving at all. So that's not to say they definitely would. And we should also bear in mind that if immigration were allowed freely, and if large numbers of people did move to wealthier states, then this would really change the dynamic entirely, and the benefits perhaps for people in second, third, fourth waves of migrating after the earlier people to do so, the benefits of that would be reduced compared to the first people to take advantage of it, and there'd be maybe more opportunities in poorer countries. The standard of living there would increase. So in practice, 40% is very much an unlikely amount, but nevertheless, it would be a very substantial number of people that would take the opportunities, given the difference in quality of life between the richest countries and the poorest ones. So that's what we're going to be considering, whether in fact that would be the right thing to do, irrespective of its consequences. And that's going to be the debate that I'm introducing you to in this video. And some people might respond by saying, well, what if we shouldn't even think about this question? It's completely irrelevant, and there might be different strategies to dismiss the question. One might be just to say, well, this is just part of what it is to be a state, is to control your borders and to decide who gets to come in and who doesn't. And then the question is, well, does that include the right to exclude everyone from coming in? You might say you can control your borders and still have a sort of open border policy where you allow people to move in. And if then the response is to say, well, stopping people from entering is just what states have been doing, and that's part of what they've been doing. If that's the case, though, it doesn't mean that it's absolutely a central task for states to continue to do this. And states supporting a particular institution or a practice doesn't mean it's the right thing to do as well. I mean, states used to support slavery, own property in human beings. Just because that was a practice, it doesn't mean it was right to do so, or that states who already did it should continue to do so. And as far as it being a key, role of the state, it could be replied that actually, I don't think passports existed until about 100 years ago, which is maybe evidence that this kind of border control isn't actually a fundamental feature of states. If we bear in mind states have been going longer than that before they introduced passports. So that kind of line of argument is quite weak. Another thought is to say that moral relations somehow only apply within a state, so between fellow citizens and the state, or fellow citizens and each other, and there just aren't moral relations beyond the border. And trying to think how you could justify this sort of view, maybe some sort of Hobbesian morality. Hobbes says morality doesn't apply if there's no state, effectively. But given that we have states, then morality does apply in our world. So that doesn't seem a very plausible line, even if you accept some of the starting points of it. Another view would be a quite very strong version of nationalism, which says that we should be partial towards our fellow nationals. But it seems like this would be a very, very strong version of that, which would say that actually people who aren't fellow nationals with us, or fellow citizens perhaps, probably nationals, that they don't have any value whatsoever. And I think few people would accept that, and even fewer philosophers would accept that kind of strong view. And I think if you think of the case Singer's person in a drowning pond case, if you have someone who would say, well, I'll save that person, but only if they're the same nationality as me. And so they go and check their wallet on the bank before they go in and save them. I think that person is pretty sort of morally deficient or morally abhorrent, and I think most people would think that too. If you can save someone's life, then you should just go about doing it. You shouldn't add that kind of caveat onto it. So I think this is a question to consider, and most people, I think, do believe in higher moral standards, which means you can't just dismiss the idea of having more open borders, or even completely open borders. But I should say something about what we might mean by this. So one way to put this is a debate between people who believe in open borders versus people who believe in closed borders, and so I want to just clarify what this doesn't mean. So one interpretation would be to say that borders should be just open all the time, which would effectively just mean there aren't actually borders at all. So this isn't a no borders view. The borders are just wrong. I mean, some people might say we should set up a world state, very controversial for lots of reasons, but I I mean, that's a view about that, but it's not to say if we do have states that they shouldn't have any kind of border in practice. And the sort of the closed borders position here is crazily strong as well. The idea that that no one should be able to move, that borders should be closed all the time. I don't think people are going to advocate that. Most people accept that immigration is sometimes a good thing, and travel is a good thing, and all these sorts of things. And so the views in this debate, the two sort of sides on taking the stronger positions here, they have actually conceded a certain amount to the other one as well. The supporters of open borders have acknowledged that the right here doesn't need to be an absolute one, and we've got at the moment a disease outbreak, and one of the responses has been to close borders to prevent the spread of the disease. And I don't think any open borders advocates could say, well, that's just, you know, a wrong thing to be doing, and particularly so because this is something that states might do within their own territory as well. And Italy, for instance, closed off certain provinces before, from other provinces. So if it's something that a state can do for public health reasons internally, then it seems perfectly legitimate for a state to do that on its external border as well. So so there's no implication that that it shouldn't be allowed in certain special circumstances, just that in normal circumstances people should be free to immigrate into a country. And other examples might be, you know, if you've got sort of people who are going to be enemies of your state, you know, people who are terrorists or who want to be terrorists, maybe just people who are very hostile to your state or your society, there might be a case to exclude them, but these would be very much exceptions. And I think maybe even some of the advocates of open borders, certainly it seems reasonable to say that there might be situations where the sheer numbers of people planning to immigrate would be such that there's a justification to limit the numbers. So if you imagine a very small island that only has so much water or something, and millions of people want to go all at the same time, and the island would run out of water, it seems like there's a good reason there to limit the number. But these are very particular cases, and the point is that in general, open borders would be the default. And then on the sort of the closed borders type position, the advocates here would say, well, there's going to be cases where states should accept certain kinds of immigrants, and refugees is one in particular. That's a right which should be granted by all decent states, and you shouldn't turn people away if their life's in danger if you reject them. So and that can then be extended potentially to their families as well if they've been accepted as refugees, and so on and so forth. So I think that people taking the sort of states' rights position here would say, states should be applying a rule-based, a fair immigration policy, and immigrants should be treated well. If they are in the society, and they generally also accept that immigration isn't a bad thing, at least up to a point. And in the case of Wellman, who's one of the authors here, he actually acknowledges there should probably be more immigration in the United States than there currently is, and you can consider that probably applies to wealthy countries generally. And David Miller is one of the other prominent people advocating for the right to exclude, and he describes his position as being a weak cosmopolitan one. So he's a nationalist, but he nevertheless accepts that if you refuse entry to people, you at least owe them an explanation as to why you've been rejected, and also that explanation has to sort of be respectful to them as well. And you can't just say, well, we'd just rather not have you. It has to be a reason about, what your state wants, and what it needs, or something like that. So it would be very wrong for the state to say, well, we just don't want your kind. We don't like your kind. That's not a sort of acceptable way to approach this. So those kind of strong positions are too strong. Those perhaps literal interpretations of open and closed borders, and perhaps more accurately, we would say what we're talking about here, if we approach this in the stronger of the more reasonable positions, on the one hand, you've got a presumed right for individuals to freely immigrate, and on the other hand, you've got a right that states have to exclude, to say no, it's up to us whether people can come here or not. We're the state, we get to decide. And so this is expressing it in terms of rights. And Joseph Carens, in his quite famous for a philosophy article, he looked at the common moral and political theories from philosophy, and he, perhaps surprisingly at the time, but maybe not so surprisingly if we bear in mind that they're all individualistic and universalistic in nature, in some form or other. So these are egalitarianism, libertarianism, consequentialism, that they actually all push us towards a kind of cosmopolitan perspective on things, because they're universalistic and take account of individuals. And as a result, they actually push us towards the position that we could call open borders for our purposes, which is the presumed right to immigrate, for people to have freedom to move and set up in other countries. So that paper really started this debate, and it sort of put the defenders of the status quo very much on the back foot, trying to justify why there's a right for states to exclude outsiders from entry. And so taking this question and approaching it through the framework of rights, and saying there's a right in this issue, it gives a very definitive answer. If you say, well, this is just a right that individuals have, then, well, that rights are trumps, is one way of looking at them, and so there we go. We've got our answer to it. Maybe in practice, even if there is a right, there's going to be a bit of leeway in the way this gets cashed out. But certainly, if you can demonstrate a right here, then that really gives you a strong conclusion. And alternatively, you know, there's the other right on the state's part. If you can show that the state should have a right to discretion over who comes in and who isn't going to be allowed to come in, then that also leads you to this strong conclusion. I don't see why necessarily we could say that both rights can't hold. You could say, well, both states have this right and individuals have a right, but obviously they're going to clash, so they're not compatible. So in practice, if someone did want to say they both hold, then they're going to have to say that one of them is just trumps the other one. So maybe logically you could have both, but really you're going to have to pick one if you go down the rights route. But do we have to just say it's just one or the other here? Might there not be options in the middle? And I think that's a viable alternative way to go. That we're sort of instead of saying we should just treat this as a matter of rights and just choose which position to take, we could take it in a different kind of way. And so I'll mention an approach that Chris Bertram's taken to this in his recent very short book on the topic, and he takes an impartial approach, and it's not one that necessarily starts out by arguing for the right of either party. And so Bertram follows Kant, and we might say, you know, people who are familiar with Rawls's original position might sort of recognise the move here, which is to say, well, what kind of immigration system of immigration rules would you choose if you didn't know what country you lived in? And so you might be someone who lives in a poor country and you'd like to move to a rich country for the opportunities that are better there. But on the other hand, you might be someone who lives in a rich country and you're concerned about the impacts of immigration and what impact that might have on your standard of living or something like that. So you're weighing up the issue, not just sort of taking one side or the other, but seeing which one wins out in this sort of balancing approach. And then he sets out several kinds of alternatives here, types of immigration system rules that you could have, and says that that people would sign up to a global procedural system, which would take account of the interests of the different parties, and it's one that would not be a case of then individuals just having this right or states having the right to choose. It would be, you know, maybe some sort of UN body or something would look at the cases, and in most cases, given the way it would go, I think Bertram's conclusion is that actually it would be much closer to the open borders type position, the presumed right to immigrate position, but that there might be a few exceptions where, for example, a state would be sort of very changed through immigration or something like that. So that there might be the odd case where immigration would be limited, but generally speaking, there'd be much more free immigration than there is. So it's a sort of a weighing up approach, which then actually does end up quite close to the open borders one, but it's not just saying, well, it's just a right here, and you're just trying to justify a very strong right. So that's a different way of approaching this issue, which actually is going to take account of a lot of the points. If you do read the literature between the people trying to argue for a strong right one way or the other, then if you take this kind of balancing approach, you're going to take into account all of these different points that the two sides have been making against each other. So even if you think, well, this sounds like a much more sensible way to go, it's still worth looking back at that literature and seeing the factors that the thinkers have been bringing in to bear, or at least some sort of summary. And in fact, Bertram himself does bring several of those arguments in within his books. It's a useful place to start. Okay, so these are the ways you could go on the topic. It seems like the people arguing for the right to exclude, although they've got the sort of the power in the issue, they're more on the back foot in terms of the philosophy. So they need to come up with justifications for this status quo, the state's rights as things stand, state's discretion. And so David Miller and Walzer and Wellman have provided some arguments along this line, and arguments that mass immigration might undermine political stability, that it might undermine political solidarity, and that might lead to the loss of the stability of the welfare state. That's one sort of line of argument you could get, and that would undermine equality. Maybe if you think equality is important within states. That's one line of argument, but it does, I should flag up, depend on a lot of quite controversial empirical premises about the implications of immigration, and so on and so forth. And so it relies on these points, which maybe there's some social science evidence that could be used to back it up, but social science evidence is always a difficult thing to have proof about, due to the nature of the of the beast there. So it's not necessarily the best grounds for an argument that would reach a very strong conclusion about full discretion for states to control their borders, control immigration. And of course, these are factors that could be taken into account within a procedural approach anyway. If you want to take a more of a balancing approach, then these are things that would be brought into that. Maybe a more promising argument that seems to relate to a well-established right is from Wellman, and this is an argument based on freedom of association, and extending that to say, well, if you want to say that people are free to associate, then they should also be free to not associate, i.e. to exclude people. And so this maybe seems like something that's going to be on stronger grounds. There's no empirical evidence that you need to build into your argument here. And so there's a sort of extensive debate about the freedoms involved here, but I'll just flag up that actually thinkers who've advocated for the more open borders position, like Carens and Philip Cole, they've actually used freedom as a sort of method to argue for the opposite conclusion. And so the idea that a right to associate means that maybe people should be able to hire hire foreigners to work for them, and that means that the foreigners should be able to move to the country and do the job. Carens points out that there's a well-established right of freedom of movement within states. That's listed in many human rights conventions. And if we think that this is an important thing for people to do within states, then doesn't it follow that it's an important thing for people to be able to do across borders as well? If the reasons apply within states, then don't they apply outside states? And Philip Cole points out that people have a right to emigrate. That's a commonly listed right, an accepted right. But if you have a right to emigrate, then that right only means something if you have a right to go somewhere else. So Cole tries to build up from that into a right to immigrate, and this has been responded to by Wellman and Miller. So there's sort of back and forth here on this one. But then these are the arguments that seem to maybe be the stronger ones to justify full state discretion. But it seems like there's counterpoints to them. There's been others, and so I've listed these as well. From equality, from democracy, people can just vote if voters don't want, to have an open border, then that's just democracy. But you can see Abizideh's response to that is to say, well, democracy means people voting over things that affect them, and borders affect people outside the border as well. So that could only get you so far, saying that democracy is important. So there's a back and forth there, just like with equality and with efficiency. And Bertram also considers brain drain as a potential argument to limit immigration, really in order to limit emigration from poor states. But yeah, these are arguments that maybe could be considered, but they're all controversial issues, and it seems like the arguments for the status quo are still a bit on the back foot on this issue. So I'll stop here. All I've done really is to sort of get you started really on this topic, and so you can sort of, if you're interested, you can read more about it. You can research the debates. The reading I gave out focuses on it's from Carens, so perhaps focusing on his arguments is a good way to go. And I'll put some links in the description for this that you can follow up. There's other YouTube videos about this as well. But yeah, hopefully this will give you a good starting point for looking into that.